In the previous presentation, we got Playmaker downloaded, installed, and configured in our Unity viewport. And then we experimented with a simple one-state machine. Now, remember, my state machine is attached to my cube object, and I want to remove the current state machine from the object and rebuild this from the ground up. And so, in the event that you want to remove a state machine from an existing object, just identify the object, select it, and go find the state machine in the Playmaker editor window. You can then right-click on the start of the state machine and choose to remove the FSM component. Now I'm going to deselect that just for a moment because I also want to draw to your attention that if you select an object that has a state machine attached to it, in the process of adding a state machine, we've also inherited a Playmaker FSM component that has some additional details in it. That's just another indicator that the object that you have selected has a state machine on it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right click on start and choose to remove that FSM component. When I do that, you can see that we lose the FSM component in the inspector window, and we also lose the little icon that was attached in the hierarchy. So what I want to do is I want to turn this into just a real simple platform that kind of moves back and forth. Now I'm going to change its position a little bit. I'm actually going to adjust some of the basic properties of it. I'll make the X a little, oops, not that big. I'll make it a little bit bigger. So I'll make it probably a 5 by 5. I'll leave it 1 along the Y. And so what I want to happen is I just want this, this cube kind of start in a position like so. Actually, maybe I'll make the Y about 0.5. And what I want to do is I just want to move this platform more or less back and forth. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select the object, make sure it's selected. I'm going to right click in the Playmaker editor window and choose to add FSM. Once I do that, I'm going to confirm that I have state 1 selected. Now if I deselect, you can tell that it's no longer highlighted because we're going to quickly get to the point where we have multiple states on an object. I'm going to select state 1, I'm going to go to the actions browser, and I'm going to go find the translate action. I'll double click and that adds the translate action to state 1. So the idea is that when this object is born, it starts and runs whatever is in state 1. What I'm going to do is I'm going to choose to move this in its Z direction. So I'm going to have it move away from this hill. So that's just my blue axis. And what I'll do, like I demonstrated before, instead of using the self space, I think I'll use the world space. It'll make it a little bit more absolute. I want to move it along the Z axis, and so instead of using a variable to move it, I'm going to toggle this button off so I can hardwire a value in. And I'll type in 10 just to see what the speed of this is, and I can always come back and change it, but it's set to world per second every frame. And I'll hit the play button and just see what that gives me. Now I'm looking, and that's actually moving a lot faster than I want it to, because maybe I want to be able to jump on this platform and leap from platform to platform. So I'm going to take this down to about 5, and I can continue to play with this this value a little bit more, but I think that'll give us the information that we need to get this up and running. So that's moving fairly slow. That's just about what I want. Now what I want to do is I want to move this object away from me for just a second or two and then have it stop and turn around and come back and just kind of ping pong back and forth between these two positions. Now there's several different ways that I can do this. I can be very precise about the distance that it moves, but I'm going to choose a really simple method of doing this, and that's using a wait function or a wait action. And I can find this if I go back to the action browser and I'm looking for the time component here, the time category. I find the wait action, and I'm going to double click to add the wait, or more precisely, maybe I'll click and drag. And the reason I'm going to click and drag this time around rather than double clicking, or maybe I'll demonstrate here by double clicking, is that if I double click, I load the action by default at the top of the state. And the reality is that I want this wait to end up underneath the translate. So there's an order here, there's a hierarchy. And in the case of wait, I'm just going to drag and drop the wait lower in the list so that it's moving. These two will run simultaneously, but I don't want it for any reason to kind of get hung up on waiting. And I want translate to be the priority. So anything that you want it to be a priority in the action order, make sure that it's in the top of the list. So it's currently translating 5 per second along the Z, and I want to do this for 1 second. And when it's done, I want to add a finished event. Now the finished event, the way that Playmaker transitions from one state to the next is by using events. Now, events are just, you can think of them kind of like tags or road signs. These are things that you create, that you describe, so that you can organize your transitions effectively. Now, in this case, we're only going to have one transition leaving the state one because we're just waiting for an amount of time, but very quickly we're going to get into a situation where we're going to have multiple transitions exiting from a state. So based on a condition, we could say, oh, if our player touches this object, exit the transition this way. If we don't touch the object and after 4 seconds, let's transition another way. So you can have a couple of different states or a couple of different actions executing depending on what the conditions are on screen. We'll take a closer look at that a bit later. What I want to do is, currently I'm looking at my state tab. What I want to do is I want to go to my events tab, and this is the place where you create events. Now, you can name events anything that you want. I'm just going to go back to the bottom of the screen, and it says add event. So I'm going to type a name. I'm going to call this, wait for it, ... and I'm going to hit return. The minute that I do that, you can see that I have an event called wait for it. And we can really name these anything that we want. So we want to name them something that's going to kind of make sense to us. I'm going to go back to my state tab. And if I go back to the wait action, I can see here that we have this time field. It's 1. We want to do it in real time, so I'll check the little real time box. But where it says finished event, you'll see that when I click on this drop down menu, we have a choice of none, which is not much of a choice at all. And we have any event that we've created in the events tab. And as I mentioned, we can have multiple events here, but for the sake of this demo, I really only need just the one event. So I'm going to choose the wait for it event, and you'll see that Playmaker does a pretty good job of warning me that I'm still missing some information. So I get this exclamation point that pops up, I get the exclamation point that pops up over here, and again down here. So Playmaker is cautioning me that it doesn't have all the information that it needs. Now, the way that events work is that you need to not only, when necessary, an action might need a finished event to figure out where it's going to go next. In addition to that, each state, if we want to transition from one state to the next, we need to do that with transition events. Now, what I'm going to do to demonstrate this point is I'm going to right-click just over here in kind of the gray workspace. I'm going to right-click and add an additional state. So I have state 1 and I have state 2. If I click on state 1, you can see that I have all of my actions here. If I click on state 2, we don't have any actions here just yet. I'm going to go back to state 1. I've already created an event. And so what I need to do is I need to add to state 1, I need to add that event as a transition, and I can do that by right-clicking on it and choose Add Transition. You'll see from this list, in addition to some system functions, some custom and system events, we have this wait for it. So any events that you have built into the state machine will be listed here. And what I want to do is I want to choose wait for it. So now I have a state and I have a transition event. And what I can do is if I click and drag on that event, I can wire this event to a different state. So this begins that process of building essentially a mind map or a flow chart for our visual logic, our visual scripting language here. So, and let's just follow through the logic really quickly. I'm going to select state 1, and it says translate, and it's translating along the Z for 5. So as long as we're in this state, it's going to do that, whatever this action is. In this case, it moves it at a speed of 5 in the Z direction. It's going to wait for 1 second. When it's done waiting, it's going to fire off this finished event that says wait for it. The wait for it transition passes from one state to the next state. Now we can confirm this. There's nothing going on in state 2, and we'll just troubleshoot this, or we'll run this and test it. And watch what happens down here in the Playmaker editor window when we hit the play button. It's going to start in state 1. It's going to wait for 1 second. In fact, to demonstrate this, let me wait 2 seconds. That'll give you a little bit more time to pay attention to what's going on. I'm going to hit the play button. I'm going to focus down here, and I see that I'm in state 1. And after 2 seconds, it fires off to state 2. And if I go look at my cube stopped. Okay, I'll do that again. Hit the play button. This time I'll pay attention to what the cube is doing if I can find it. And by the time I found it, it already stopped. So let me add a little bit more time to this So as I'm looking around, I can find it. I'm going to add 5 seconds. I certainly should be able to find it before 5 seconds is up. There it goes. So it's moving, and I'll notice that when that action fires down here in the Playmaker editor, it passes it to state 2. That gives us a lot of possibilities. So with a few clicks of the mouse, we've created a really simple state machine that says move for 5 seconds, and then by default it's stopping because we're passing it to a state with no information. Well, let's modify this state just a little bit. I'm going to go back to transform. I'm going to translate once again. I'm going to translate in the world space. I want to translate along the z-axis, and this time rather than going +5, which will send me off in this direction, I'm going to choose -5, and I'll hit return. The next thing I'm going to do, you guessed it, I'm going to go to the time category. I'm going to find wait. I'm going to double click and add my wait time. Now again, I could leave this up here and it'll probably work just fine, but it's a good practice to get our actions in order in terms of priority, and I definitely want it to move before it starts to wait. And now I'm going to leave this finished event off here just to show you that without the finished event and without the finished transition, we end up stuck in state 2. So I'm going to hit the play button, and I'll look around, and my state 1 is working just fine. And then when it fires back to state 2, it's doing exactly what we told it to do, which was move it -5, but it gets stuck in that state and continues to fly away from us. So I'm going to toggle the play button. I'll fix the little bug that I have. I'll go back to state 2. And this is kind of a 2-step process or 3-step process. We definitely need to have an existing event, which we already created. Now, while I'm here, I'm going to create a second test event just for kicks, just to show you what happens in the drop-down menus here. I'm going to go back to my state tab, which allows me to explore the states. With state 2 selected, under the wait action, I'm waiting for a certain amount of time, and I'll make it equivalent to whatever I'm waiting for in state 1. My finished event is going to be wait for it. I'll use the exact same event that I passed state 1 to state 2. I'll just reuse that event. Call it wait for it. Make sure it's in real time, although it's not absolutely necessary at this point. But you can see that Playmaker is warning me. It's saying, wait a second, event not used by this state or any global transition, meaning that this state is not using the wait event. The wait action is using this wait event, but this state is not yet using that event. And in order to do that, we need to right click and add it as a transition. The minute that we have it as a transition, we can click and drag from it and we can wire it to anything that we want. Now in this case, we want to create a simple loop, so I'm going to pass it back to state 1. And so now we have this real simple machine that says, okay, move one direction for 5 seconds. When you're done, we're going to pass it over here. We're going to do whatever this state says, which we've designed it to move back in the opposite direction for the equivalent amount of time. And then when it's done, it's going to pass it back and forth. So we've created this loop, and we should be able to watch this platform move back and forth. So in a situation like this, there's a couple things that you need to pay attention to. First of all, the most valuable thing is to pay attention to what's going on down in the Playmaker editor window. That will show the active state that we're currently in, and we can see it passing back and forth. In addition to that, there's another heads-up display. If you notice right on my little platform there, it says state 1, and then when it switches, it says state 2. So there's a little tag that shows up that tells us what state we're in. That can be helpful, but I find it visually, can be a little busy. I'll show you how to turn that off in future presentations. I'm going to toggle the play button, and by the way, when you're looking at the Playmaker editor, you may very well have a lot of information on your screen. You might have these tips and these hints that are showing up, and they're very extremely helpful. Definitely take a look at them, but when you're dealing with states and a lot of information, you can see that there's a lot of stuff that's popping up here, and it can be very helpful to kind of cut through some of this distraction by finding your hints button at the bottom of your Playmaker editor window and just toggle that button to turn hints off. Once we become more familiar with Playmaker and how things are organized and arranged, we can turn that back on and see what other kind of functionality there is. I'm going to rebuild that state machine in just a few seconds in just 30 seconds or less. I'm not going to explain every step, but I'm just going to show you really quickly from a workflow standpoint how we could build that really quickly. So I'm going to right click. I'm going to remove the current FSM. That completely destroys it, including any states that were on it, including any events that we created, and had we created any variables, those would all be a thing of the past. So I have my cube, and it's probably a good time to call this platform. I want to stay on top of my naming convention here. I'm going to right click and add a state machine. Now the function of the state machine, its primary function is to translate. It's going to send this platform in the direction of Z. We determined 5 was a pretty good speed. I'm not going to rotate this platform, but I am going to set it to world. That'll give me a little bit more control over it in certain cases. I'm going to go back to the time category. I'll drag and drop wait. I want to make sure that shows up at the bottom. I'm going to wait for, this time around I'll do 4 seconds. You'll notice I don't have any finished events, so I'll go to event. I'll use the same name that I created. Hit return to apply that event. Now I'll go back to my actions and set that as the finished event. I also need to make sure that's set up as a transition. I need another state, and I'll wire that transition over to state 2. I'll select state 2, and I'll just do the same thing that I just did. I'll add a translate. The only difference here is that along the Z, instead of doing a +5, I'm going to choose -5. I'm going to go to the time category. I'm going to choose wait. I think I used 4 seconds before, so I'll use 4 seconds. Check real time. I'm going to borrow the same event that I had the first time, the wait for it, that I used in state 1. I'll just reuse that. I'll add it as a transition and wire that back to state 1. I'll do a quick check of state 1 and audit this really quickly. I can see that I have a translate that's going to move it in the positive direction of 5 for 4 seconds. I'll make that real time. We'll talk about real time and not real time here a little bit later. I'll go into state 2, and I just confirm that I'm just moving in the opposite direction again for that wait time. I really wouldn't notice the difference if I was using real time or not real time. Not a big difference here. We'll talk about that if we decide to compress time or pause time, but we'll save that for a later presentation. Now what I'll do is I'll hit the play button and make sure that my platform is doing what I intend it to do. And there we go. I have my platform moving around. With any luck, I can go jump on this thing, and I can ride my platform off into the sunset, or at least for 5 seconds before it turns around and heads back in the other direction. So that's a basic Playmaker machine. We're going to do a lot more with Playmaker. In fact, we're going to spend the rest of the semester using Playmaker to quickly add some functionality. Now, unless you're really well versed in programming, it probably would have taken us quite some time to write a script that would allow this to ping pong back and forth. So one of the real great advantages of Playmaker is that even as designers, we can rapidly prototype a concept really quickly. So we'll keep pushing this forward, but we'll do that in the next presentation.